I recommend this book as an important guide for those looking to improve their public speaking and oratory skills. It offers valuable advice and insights from famous speakers that can be beneficial for anyone wishing to communicate effectively and influence an audience. Book: Speak Like Churchill, Stand Like Lincoln, 21 Powerful Secrets of History's Greatest Speakers. Author: James Hughes. The Power of the Opening Pause. This technique was used by Bonaparte, Hitler, and Elizabeth. Start speaking not immediately, but wait for a while, looking at the faces of the listeners. A significant pause is perceived as a key to increasing the significance of the message. If someone from the audience asks you a question, do not rush to answer, even if you are ready, but pause. This will add weight to your words and improve their perception by the listeners. An expressive pause is also needed to create an atmosphere of significance. For example, in 1957, Elizabeth began her speech with an expressive pause, thereby capturing the attention of the admiring audience, and in the atmosphere created, the official greeting sounded sincere and deep. However, the same speech of the Queen, published the next day in the newspaper, looked completely banal. The power of the first phrase. Start any speech with a powerful beginning, starting with something unoriginal. You risk appearing dull and boring. That is, if you start with thanks, or say that you respect the organizers, etc., it will look banal, because everyone does it. If you don't capture attention from the very first seconds, everyone will be in their own thoughts, not listening to you. Start with words that immediately grab attention, and then express your opinion. Thus, your words will explode in an unprepared hall, and they will listen to you with all attention. It doesn't matter if you're a salesman or a politician. This rule applies to everyone. If you need to convey some tragic news or a serious fact, you can immediately get down to business. For example, in 1941, Roosevelt did just that. He said, "Yesterday, December 7, 1941, the United States was attacked by the military and air forces of the Empire of Japan." If you really want to express special respect or gratitude for the opportunity to speak, choose a moment in the middle of your speech for this, when they will sound sincere, not a banality at the beginning of your speech. The power of image. George Washington, like no one else, maintained his image in front of everyone, making solemn visits to new states. Before entering the city, he would get out of the carriage, tidy up his clothes, clean his shoes, mount his white stallion, and only then solemnly enter the city. Clothing can say a lot about its owner. For example, Benjamin Franklin deliberately did not dress like the courtiers of Louis XVI. He did not wear a wig and wore a simple woolen coat. He wanted to show that he was a pioneer, not a pompous courtier. And James Monroe, the fifth President of the United States, continued to wear his officer's uniform and cap with a cockade when everyone else wore breeches and stockings. He reminded guests of his merits during the War for Independence and preferred to be called Colonel Monroe, not President Monroe. Many incorporated something into their image. For example, Abraham Lincoln made his calling card a top hat, and Churchill had a cigar. This made them stand out among others. Your image, in this case, should be constant, not changing from day to day. Key moment. For any speech, you should first formulate the key idea that you want to convey to your audience, and then write the speech itself, to strengthen the main idea. It should be supplemented with examples and cases from life. For example, when starting to write an autobiography, if your main idea is to convey that you are a peacemaker, then in each chapter, starting from childhood, you need to show this. The same goes for your speech. Therefore, first set yourself a goal of where you want to arrive. For example, increase research volume or increase sales, and then all your words should work towards achieving the planned result. Examples, stories, statistics, etc. In this case, you need to decide whom you want to persuade. For example, if it's the financial director, all your arguments should be aimed at increasing profits. Everything else won't interest him. But if it's the head of the marketing department, you will need a different approach. The same applies to sales. For example, Benjamin Franklin bought out a bankrupt soap-making company that advertised that their soap washes better than any other. Franklin knew that this brand of soap was often bought by women, so he added a line to the packaging of each bar. Franklin's soap makes hands softer and more feminine, and soap sales soared. This happened because he knew who to persuade to buy. The power of brevity. The less is more rule is considered universal. The most laconic president was Calvin Coolidge. He always spoke briefly and to the point. Speaking briefly also means surprising your audience. For example, if they are expecting a 20 to 30-minute speech, surprise them by finishing in 5 minutes. It's better to be brief than boring. In addition, A brief speech is better remembered and people start quoting it, and if you also make the audience laugh with it, the performance will be remembered for a long time. For example, by telling a joke or a story that concisely conveys your idea. If each participant in a debate is given 20 minutes, it is not necessary to use all the time. Stick to 5 to 10 minutes, but complement your brevity with confidence and expressiveness. Be witty and decisive, and then you can consider yourself a winner. For example, Franklin Roosevelt's inaugural address in January 1945 lasted 3 minutes and boiled down to the fact that during wartime, long speeches are not needed, but rather work in the achievement of peace. This even works in advertising. Advertising agencies say that the most effective advertising is one sentence on an empty page. The advertiser buys a whole page but uses only a small area. The power of quotation. The first rule of quoting: the quote should be familiar to you. That is, never quote an author you are not familiar with, because you may mispronounce the author's name, or the author may have a different point of view from yours, or you may be asked something about their life, since you probably studied it if you're quoting them, and you will not look good. The second rule: the author's name should be familiar to the audience, and the quote should not be long. The third rule: quoting your opponent can be unexpected. Choose a phrase that you can use against the opponent themselves. For example, during a presentation, one of the leaders pulled out a clipping from an old issue of the New York Times, in which his company was predicted to experience a profit decline. He read this forecast, crumpled the clipping, and threw it in the trash. If you use a quote, emphasize it intonationally so that it becomes truly expressive, and use only one strong quote in your speech. You can write them down in a notebook, categorizing them, for example, business, life, travel, etc., so that you can quickly find the one you need. The power of statistics. The most difficult thing for an orator is to present statistical data in a way that the audience will remember. Therefore, always paint vivid pictures. For example, to explain what $1 billion deficit means, ask someone to imagine someone stacking one bill on top of another, and this line will reach the moon and back. You should remember that many numbers in your speech put the audience to sleep. If you do need to present numerical data, studies show that from one presentation, a listener can remember only one example. For example, annual profit increased by 17%. If you have more examples, choose the best one. At the same time, present the data in a more understandable and memorable form. For example, not 51% of California's population, but just over half of the population. Or not 38,000 Britons, but 6 out of 10 Britons. Try to link numerical examples to the numbers 5 or 10. For example, again, not 21%, but 1 in 5. It's easier for people to remember this way. Or, like with the moon example, paint pictures for people. For example, at Harvard, students were asked to look at the person sitting on their right, then on their left, and only then were told that one of those students they just looked at would not return to Harvard next year. They explained the 32% dropout rate in such a simple way. If you need to express large numbers, take out a piece of paper from your pocket and read them, even if you remember them by heart. Psychologically, this will show your listeners that you have conducted proper research and recorded the facts you gathered, rather than just taking them from your head, so no one will doubt your numbers. Leakage of power. In this chapter, the author is unhappy that managers rely only on slides in all their presentations. They show slides, commenting on each one, and their presentation ends there. He believes they do this because they are afraid to communicate with the audience face to face, not because it's easier to convey information this way, and making comments on slides is easier than composing a full-fledged speech. Therefore, he advises not to show slides for most of your presentation, but to convey your thoughts correctly using words. Use slides occasionally to support your speech, not to completely replace words. Slides also distract the attention of your audience from you. As the speaker, you should be in the spotlight. At the same time, your slides should be so simple that they can be easily understood at a glance. The power of gesture. Sometimes gestures can say more than words. For example, Washington was not very talkative. He always tried to act in a way that let his actions speak for him. He demonstrated the power of silence in 1783 when bidding farewell to his officers after the signing of the Treaty of Paris. He simply approached the officers, looked them in the eyes, and nodded. Some of them later wrote in their memoirs that this was the most significant moment of their lives. Bill Clinton also often used gestures. He had many techniques in his arsenal: pursed lips in anguish, a gaze directed at the ceiling in search of an answer to a difficult question, or an angry fist pounding the table. His most famous gesture was raising his index finger when he claimed he did not have sexual relations with Monica Lewinsky. This lent credibility to his words. He was a great performer. The power of reading. A person can tell a story in a captivating manner, but as soon as they start reading from a piece of paper, their voice becomes lifeless, flat, and unexpressive. Ronald Reagan faced this problem. He overcame it by reading a sentence to himself and then saying it aloud without looking at the paper. You can also apply this approach to reading newspaper articles. Read a couple of lines, then look away and retell what you read. Soon, this will become part of your reading rhythm. The first rule of effective speaking: never say a word while your eyes are on the paper. Looking down breaks your connection with the listeners. You should look at the audience when addressing them. The second rule: use the look, pause, say technique. Lower your gaze and mentally photograph the words you are looking at. Raise your head again and pause, then tell everything you remembered. And do this with each line. Don't worry that the audience will get bored during these pauses. On the contrary, it will give them time to digest what you said. Even in ordinary speech, without reading from a paper, you should pause. If you think you'll look silly, record yourself on camera, and you'll see that pauses give your speech a conversational tone. Learn. It takes practice. The power of question. A question makes the listener react. For example, in the presidential race between Reagan and Carter, Reagan asked the audience, "Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? If yes, then vote for President Carter. If not, then vote for me." From that moment on, Carter's campaign fell apart. It can even be a rhetorical question. For example, to get rid of slavery, one could ask, "Do you want yourself or your relatives to be put in chains?" The power of the key word. If you need to emphasize a meaningful word or phrase, it's most effective to pause briefly before it. For example, on the air, news, or these were our best times. In the book, the author provides even more useful advice. There are plenty of other useful books. Write about which ones you would like to hear about.